So the next time you are standing in an airport security line, I want you to consider this. That gray plastic bin you just tossed your shoes and your phone into, it is mathematically the most dangerous thing in the entire building.
Which is pretty wild to think about.
Right. Welcome to this deep dive. Because, for most of us, going to the airport is just this exercise in managed stress. You know, you are dragging a suitcase with a wobbly wheel, nervously checking your watch.
And mentally preparing to buy a bottle of water that costs as much as a small meal.
Exactly. We just tend to view airports as these frustrating waiting rooms we have to endure. But our mission today is to completely flip that perspective.
Because it really is just a perspective issue.
Yeah, we have pulled together this massive stack of research. It's a really comprehensive overview of airport infrastructure, history, and operations. And when you look at all this data, you realize an airport is not a waiting room at all.
Not even close.
It's a highly orchestrated, self-sustaining mini-city that is basically hiding in plain sight.
The sheer scale of what happens behind the scenes while you are drinking that overpriced coffee, it's just staggering. Every single detail you encounter exists for a very specific reason.
And by the end of this deep dive, you will never look out of a terminal window the same way again. We are going to uncover why pilots almost always turn left, why engineers design runways to literally disintegrate on purpose.
Which sounds completely counterintuitive.
Totally. And how your hand-washing habits at the gate mathematically impact the entire planet. But before we get to the exploding runways, I realized something while looking through the research.
What's that?
I didn't actually know the technical definition of an airport. Like, what makes a runway an actual airport?
Well, the terminology is actually surprisingly strict. So the umbrella term used in aviation is aerodrome.
Aerodrome. That sounds very vintage.
It does, yeah. But that covers absolutely any area where aircraft take off and land. It could be a patch of dirt in the wilderness or like a helipad on a hospital.
Okay, so then what makes it an airport?
An airport implies a specific legal stature. In most jurisdictions, a facility only becomes an airport when it meets rigorous certification criteria from civil aviation authorities.
Meaning it has a mountain of paperwork.
Exactly. In the U.S., the legal definition requires it to be a landing area used regularly for receiving or discharging passengers or cargo. So it brings a whole host of regulatory and safety requirements with it.
Which is a far cry from how all of this started, because the earliest airports were literally just grassy fields.
Well, absolutely. A pilot would just look at a windsock and land from whatever direction worked best that day.
Yeah, and there is actually this intense historical debate over what the oldest operating airport in the world even is.
It is a highly contested title. You have Tuzla-Noble near Paris claiming 1907.
Right.
Then College Park in Maryland claims 1909, Hamburg in 1911, and Amsterdam Schiphol in 1916.
So why can't they just agree on a date?
Well, the debate usually comes down to what you consider continuous commercial operation. Versus a field that was temporarily taken over for military use or just general aviation.
Regardless of who is first, those grass fields have obviously evolved into multi-billion-dollar economic engines. And the economics of how this mini-city pays for itself is just wild.
It really is.
Because I always assumed airports just, took a cut of the airline ticket. But the revenue is actually split into 3 distinct streams.
Yeah, let's break those down because they directly dictate your entire passenger experience.
Yeah.
So you have non-operating revenue, which is things like grants or investments.
And that makes up about 16%, right?
Correct. Then you have aeronautical revenue.
Yeah.
This is the money the airport makes directly from the airlines for the privilege of using the infrastructure. That accounts for roughly 50%.
And it is not just some flat membership fee. Airlines pay landing fees based on the weight and size of the aircraft.
Very heavily based on weight, yeah.
But the part that really blew my mind is that even parking costs money. I'm just picturing a pilot feeding a giant parking meter. What does it actually cost an airline just to sit at the gate?
It is incredibly expensive.
Yeah.
So at a major hub like JFK in New York, an airline is charged about $45 an hour to park a 100,000-pound plane.
Wow.
And that price scales up dramatically the heavier the plane gets. A massive international wide-body jet could cost hundreds of dollars an hour just to sit still.
So a plane sitting at a gate is a plane that is actively bleeding money. No wonder they start rushing us the second the door opens.
Exactly. Time is quite literally money.
But that aeronautical stuff only covers half the budget. The remaining 34% is non-aeronautical revenue. And this is where the airport makes its money off of us, the passengers.
Right. This is the retail shops, the food courts, the duty-free, and, of course, parking our cars.
Oh, the parking. The research mentioned O'Hare in Chicago charges $2 an hour per car just for economy parking.
And vastly more for the prime spots near the terminal.
Yeah, so when I look at those numbers, the analogy that immediately comes to my mind is that modern airports are basically massive shopping malls that just happen to have runways attached to them.
That is a highly accurate analogy.
Mhm.
In fact, airport architects actually rely on it. Have you noticed how many new airports are explicitly designed with walk-through duty-free stores?
Oh, where they physically force you to navigate that serpentine retail maze right after security.
Yes. You have
That's-
to walk past all the perfume and liquor before you can even find your departure gate.
Yeah.
That concession revenue is absolutely what keeps the facility afloat.
Wait, I have to push back on this entire economic model, though.
Okay, go for it.
If I want to fly out of a specific city, I can't exactly build my own competing runway in the suburbs. The airport is basically a local monopoly.
That's true.
So what stops them from just jacking up the landing fees to astronomical levels? Why aren't the airlines just getting price gouged out of existence?
That is a great question, and it is the exact reason governments step in. Because an airport is a natural monopoly, aviation authorities use something called price cap regulation.
Okay, to limit how much they can charge.
Exactly. It strictly limits how much airports can legally charge airlines.
But how do they even calculate a fair cap for that?
They use a system called the dual till or single till approach. Essentially, regulators look at all that money the airport is making from you buying overpriced sandwiches and parking your car.
The non-aeronautical revenue.
Right. So in a single till system, the regulator forces the airport to use those retail profits to subsidize the aeronautical side.
Oh, interesting.
They calculate the total cost of running the airport, subtract the shopping mall profits, and whatever is left is the absolute maximum they are allowed to charge the airlines in landing fees.
That completely flips how I view the food court. Buying a ridiculously expensive bottle of water is actually keeping my airline ticket cheaper.
In a roundabout way, yes, it really is. The retail side subsidizes the aviation side.
Okay, so since we know the airlines are paying these astronomical fees just to park at the gate, they must be desperate to land, unload, and take off as fast as humanly possible.
Oh, absolutely.
So I want to look at how the airport actually manages that traffic, because for the longest time, I just assumed a commercial jet punched a GPS coordinate into the autopilot and flew in a straight line down to the runway.
That is a very common misconception. I mean, modern instruments do allow for precise straight-in approaches,
Sure.
but the underlying architecture of airport traffic, especially when queuing up multiple planes, is built around a visual traffic pattern.
Like a giant invisible rectangle in the sky.
Exactly. Before they even touch down, aircraft enter this rectangular circuit,
Hmm.
usually flown at an altitude of about 800 to 1,000 feet above the ground.
And the standard protocol requires all turns in this pattern to be made to the left.
Yes, all left-hand turns.
I found the reason for that so fascinating. Why always turn left? It's because the pilot in command, the captain, sits on the left side of the cockpit.
Right.
Turning left just gives them the best possible downward visibility through the side window so they can keep the runway in sight at all times.
It is a perfect example of designing a massive, complex system around basic human ergonomics.
Hmm.
You just make the safest action the easiest one to perform.
Makes total sense.
Yeah.
So the plane makes its left-hand turns, lines up, and lands. And this is where a very specific handoff happens in air traffic control.
It's a highly coordinated dance.
Because I always pictured one guy in a tower managing the whole thing. But it is more like a relay race baton pass at 150 miles per hour.
That is a great way to visualize it. You have tower control, which owns the active runways and the airspace immediately around the airport.
Right.
But the absolute millisecond a plane's wheels touch down and its tail clears the runway boundary line, tower control passes the baton to ground control.
And ground control is responsible for the taxiways, the aprons, which, by the way, I learned is the official term for the tarmac where the planes park.
Yes, the apron.
And they handle all the chaotic traffic on the ground. Not just the planes, but the baggage trains, the fuel trucks, the snowplows.
It requires a profound level of spatial awareness because once that plane parks at the gate, the ground handling crew just descends on it.
It really is a frantic sprint. You've got the baggage handlers unloading the belly, the fuel truck hooking up the wing, the cleaners rushing the cabin, the caterers loading the food.
All happening simultaneously.
The research notes that an efficient ground crew can achieve a full turnaround from arriving at the gate to pushing back for departure in just 25 minutes.
Which is incredible when you think about it.
It looks like a Formula One pit stop, except instead of a tiny race car, it's a massive piece of heavy machinery. And instead of 5 guys with wrenches, it's an army of people handling hundreds of suitcases.
And just like a pit stop, a single miscommunication can be disastrous. When you have all that heavy machinery darting around a confined apron, human error has to be systematically engineered out of the process.
How do they actually do that, though? Because from the terminal window, it just looks like pure chaos.
Well, it comes down to universal, unbending standardization, particularly with the lighting system. A pilot or a tug driver never has to guess where they are.
Because of the color coding.
Exactly. If you look out the window at night, you will see a specific sea of lights. Blue lights strictly indicate the outer, safe edges of a taxiway.
Okay, blue is the edge.
And green lights are embedded in the center of the taxiway to guide the aircraft's nose wheel perfectly along the path.
And then there are the red lights.
Right. The red lights indicate the absolute boundary. They mark the holding position just short of an active runway.
So you don't accidentally drive onto a runway where a plane is landing.
Exactly. A pilot will never, ever cross a red light until tower control explicitly speaks to them and gives them clearance.
So the blue and green guide you, and the red stops you from wandering into disaster. But, I mean, even with the most perfect lighting system in the world, things go wrong.
They do.
A 25-minute pit stop with a 100-ton vehicle has inherent risks. So I want to transition into how this mini-city protects its citizens from hazards, starting with the massive physical threats.
Well, one of the most persistent physical threats to an airport is actually biological. It's birds.
Birds.
Yeah, because airports require large tracts of flat, open land. They're often built near wetlands or agricultural fields.
Which is basically prime real estate for flocks of birds.
Exactly. It creates a perfect nesting environment, which leads to bird strikes. And that is a massive, critical danger to jet engines during takeoff and landing.
But beyond the birds, there are these invisible meteorological threats. I had never heard of a microburst until I read this research, and frankly, it is terrifying.
They're incredibly dangerous. Microbursts are one of the most violent weather phenomena an aircraft can encounter. They are highly localized, intense columns of sinking air that occur during thunderstorms.
But how does sinking air swat a massive plane out of the sky?
It is all about how that air behaves when it hits the ground. So imagine pouring a bucket of water onto a flat floor. The water hits and violently splashes outward in all directions.
Right, it spreads out.
When a downdraft of air hits the runway, it does the exact same thing. So a plane flying into a microburst first hits an extreme headwind, which artificially generates a massive amount of lift.
Okay, so the plane suddenly wants to go up.
Yes, and the pilot's natural instinct is to push the nose down to stay on the correct glide path.
Oh, no, I see where this is going.
Exactly. Because seconds later, the plane passes through the center of the downdraft and suddenly hits the extreme tailwind on the other side.
And all that lift is just gone.
It instantly vanishes.
Yeah.
And if the pilot has just pushed the nose down, the aircraft simply falls out of the sky.
That is horrifying.
It is. Since the tragic crash of Delta Flight 191 in the 1980s, which was caused by this exact phenomenon, airports have installed highly specialized Doppler radar systems.
They spot the wind splashing on the ground?
Exactly. They monitor the wind shear on the glide path and give pilots a crucial 2 to 5 minute warning to abort a landing before they ever enter the microburst.
Wow. But, what if a plane does overshoot a runway, whether it's from a microburst, a slick surface, or just a mechanical failure?
Engineers have designed a brilliant fail-safe for runways that end near water, highways, or a steep drop-off. They install a section at the end of the runway called a stopway.
Okay.
And it utilizes an engineered material arresting system, or EMA.
This is the soft concrete I teased at the very beginning.
Precisely. It looks like normal runway concrete, but it is actually this highly porous cellular cement.
So it's weak on purpose.
Right. When the heavy wheels of a runaway plane hit this surface, they don't roll over it. The concrete behaves almost like styrofoam. It rapidly crushes and disintegrates under the weight of the aircraft.
It's literally eating the kinetic energy.
Exactly. It bogs the landing gear down in the crushing material, safely decelerating the plane without snapping the landing gear off.
That is amazing. The runway is quite literally engineered to destroy itself in a controlled manner to save the passengers inside the plane.
It is a sacrificial safety measure, yeah.
Okay, so that covers the massive physical threats. But let's talk about the microscopic threats, because this part of the research genuinely made my skin crawl. We need to talk about airport hygiene.
Yeah, this is where it gets a little gross.
Yeah.
Airports are, by their very nature, global mixing bowls. You have thousands of people from different continents constantly moving through confined spaces.
Right.
So they are the perfect environment for an infectious disease to hitch a ride across the world in a matter of hours.
There was a fascinating study conducted at the Helsinki-Vantaa airport in Finland. Researchers basically swabbed commonly touched surfaces all over the airport during the peak of flu season.
To see where the respiratory viruses were hanging out.
Exactly. And naturally, I assumed the public restrooms would be the absolute epicenter of disease. But the bathrooms actually tested negative for respiratory viruses.
Which highlights a really interesting aspect of human psychology. People know bathrooms are inherently dirty, so they are hyper-aware of their own hygiene while they're in them.
Plus, airport cleaning staff sanitize those areas with harsh chemicals constantly.
Right, they're cleaned all the time.
But you know what isn't sanitized constantly? The absolute most contaminated, germ-ridden items in the entire airport were the plastic security screening trays.
It is the perfect storm for transmission. You have a high-touch surface made of non-porous plastic, which allows viruses to survive for extended periods.
And everybody has to touch them.
Exactly. It is rarely wiped down between uses, and it is located at a mandatory bottleneck that every single passenger must pass through.
It's the very tray I put my phone, my jacket, and my face mask into. I'm never looking at security the same way again.
You might want to bring hand sanitizer next time.
Oh, for sure. And it gets worse because the research points out that our collective hand hygiene is just abysmal. Like, next time you are in an airport restroom, look around. The data shows that 3 out of every 10 people walking out of there haven't even touched a bar of soap.
The statistics are sobering. In an airport setting, only about 1 in 5 people, so 20%, have legitimately clean hands at any given time.
And they define that as washing with soap for at least 15 seconds in the past hour, right?
Yes, exactly, just 20%.
Yeah. This is where I really have to challenge the data, because the math in this next study sounds completely made up to me.
Let's hear it.
Researchers from MIT and the University of Cyprus built a public health model based on this hygiene data. Their model claims that if we just increase the number of people with clean hands from 20% to 30%.
Which is just a 10% bump.
Right, just a 10% bump. They claim it could reduce the potential global spread of a disease by 24%. Hold on. How does a mere 10% increase in clean hands mathematically equal a massive 24% drop in a global outbreak?
It sounds totally counterintuitive because our brains want the math to be linear.
Yeah.
But you have to think of airports as nodes in a massive interconnected network.
Okay, like a web.
Yeah. A single infected person in a major hub like Heathrow doesn't just infect one other person. They cough on their hand, touch a security tray, and leave a virus that infects 10 other people.
Right.
Now, those 10 newly infected people board 10 different flights to 10 different countries, where they each infect 10 more people.
Oh, I see. It is exponential branching.
Exactly. So when you convince just a few more people to wash their hands at that central node, you aren't just stopping one infection. You are severing an entire branch of exponential transmission across the global network.
So by washing your hands at O'Hare, you aren't just protecting yourself.
Yeah.
You are mathematically shielding the entire planet from an outbreak.
It's a huge butterfly effect.
That is incredible. But while airports are potential hubs for microscopic viruses, they also have a massive impact on the macro environment. The physical footprint of this mini-city is huge.
Oh, the environmental impact is significant. The physical act of building an airport fundamentally alters the local environment.
Because they need so much space.
Right. When you flatten thousands of acres of land and pave it over with concrete, you change how water drains, leading to agricultural runoff. But more surprisingly, you actually change the local weather patterns.
Yeah, the research specifically mentions fog. An airport can become susceptible to heavy fog in areas where fog rarely ever formed before.
Purely because the massive thermal mass of the concrete runways alters the way heat radiates and moisture condenses in the air above it.
It is a localized climate anomaly. But the much larger issue is how the global climate threatens the airports themselves.
Yes, the macro threat.
Which is deeply ironic if you think about it. Aviation is a major contributor to greenhouse gases, which accelerate climate change. But because airports require incredibly flat land and are often built on low-lying coastal areas to avoid natural obstacles like mountains, They're fundamentally threatened by the sea level rise caused by that very climate change.
The vulnerability data is a massive wake-up call for global logistics. Currently, 269 airports globally are at risk of coastal flooding.
That's already a lot.
And if global temperatures rise by 2 degrees Celsius, which is the threshold heavily discussed in the Paris Agreement, that number jumps to 364 airports.
And if we fail to curb emissions and exceed that target, the projections show that by the year 2100, up to 572 airports could be threatened by the ocean.
It's a staggering logistical nightmare. We're looking at a scenario where massive, multi-billion-dollar economic hubs either have to be completely relocated or fortified like medieval castles just to keep the water out.
Which is exactly why sustainability has shifted from just a public relations talking point to an absolute existential priority for airport management.
Definitely. And we've actually starting to see smaller airports acting as the crucial testing grounds for green technology.
Yeah, the prime example in the research is the airport in Kochi, India. It became the world's first airport to be entirely powered by solar energy.
Which is brilliant use of space.
It really is. The management realized that airports inherently possess massive amounts of flat, unshaded terminal roof space and all this unused buffer land around the runways. It is the perfect real estate for vast solar arrays.
Large international hubs have the capital to fund these green initiatives, but it is often the smaller, more agile regional airports that are proving the technology works on a municipal scale.
Absolutely. So we started this deep dive by acknowledging that the airport feels like a stressful obstacle course, but hopefully we have given you a completely new lens to view it through.
Yeah, the next time you are sitting at a gate staring out the window, you aren't just waiting in a building.
You are sitting in the epicenter of global economics, subsidized by a duty-free mall. You are watching a highly orchestrated ballet of left-handed traffic patterns and 25-minute pit stops.
All protected by disintegrating concrete and microburst radar.
It is a totally self-contained ecosystem, and its survival requires constant, vigilant management of both the physical machinery and human behavior.
It's an engineering marvel, really.
Which brings us to your immediate application for the next time you fly. When you are taxiing to the runway at night, look out the window and try to trace the blue and green lights.
And stay away from the red ones.
Yes, but far more importantly, the absolute very first thing you should do after you grab your shoes out of that plastic security tray is walk straight to the nearest restroom and wash your hands. You might literally be saving the world.
It truly is the easiest and most effective contribution an individual can make to global public health.
It really is. Now, before we wrap up, I do want to leave you with one final provocative puzzle to chew on regarding the future of this mini-city.
Okay, what is it?
So, the aviation industry is pushing hard toward electric aircraft to solve the emissions problem we just talked about. But the energy math required to pull that off is staggering.
It takes a lot of power to lift a plane.
Right. Operating just 49 small, short-range electric planes requires at least 16 gigawatt-hours of energy a year.
And because planes need those rapid 25-minute turnarounds we discussed, the charging power delivered to the gate has to be immense and instantaneous.
Exactly. To put 16 gigawatt-hours into perspective, that is like trying to plug an entire Las Vegas casino resort to a single wall outlet just to keep a few dozen small planes flying.
The grid upgrade alone would be astronomical.
So if electric battery-powered planes truly become the global standard, how will the mini-city evolve next? Will the airports of tomorrow have to transform from shopping malls with runways into massive dedicated power plants and battery farms just to keep the skies moving?
It is going to require a total reimagining of the infrastructure. The airport will literally have to generate, store, and distribute its own massive energy reserves on a scale we just haven't seen before.
It is definitely something to ponder next time you are stuck in that security line, dragging your wobbly suitcase, waiting to enter the most complicated city on Earth.